don't miss anything, Benny. Benny has been in the book business for over 40 years and most recently is MD of Welbeck Publishing. She has worked on many bestsellers, and I'm sure you've heard of them. The Tattooist of Auschwitz, which was a big one, and also The Happiness Trap. And she's worked with many different international publishers and taken Australian authors to a much wider audience. And she's also a the co-founder of Words on the Waves. That's important. So Benny and Jackie, who's at the back, Jackie was at the door, she's waving, Jackie Barton, co-founders of Words on the Waves 5 years ago. And on that note, Benny, over to you.
Thank you, Claire. Hello again, it's me. We are in grave danger of probably getting this session completely out of hand because both Fiona and I are terrible big talkers and interrupters. So if we're sort of going too fast, feel free to say, slow down, girls. Firstly, one of the things I did want to mention, and Stephanie, I come from Fegans Bay as well, so very literary place, and so did Jackie initially. But also, we've got the big festival in June, so if anyone wants to buy the tickets for the pre-sales, feel free to see the lovely girls at the back of the room. So we are here today to talk to Fiona, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our amazing guest debut author. Fiona is, as you know, it's not easy to get published, and for someone to get a book published in Australia these days is a rare feat indeed, and one that should be acknowledged because there's a lot of competition out there. We'll talk a little bit about publishing here today as well. But I sort of did a little bit of research on Fiona, and I found an article that she had written in the Sydney Morning Herald, and the headline was, "From Aerialist to Clown Doctor, How My Colourful Past Led to a Writing Career." And then the first paragraph read, "Most of us spent our early adult years contemplating the big questions. In fact, if you weren't being existential, you felt you were just not doing young adulthood at all. My earnest young brow was permanently wrinkled in a single driving question. Why, oh why wasn't I famous yet?" Please make welcome Fiona Britton.
Look, this is probably as famous as I've ever been. So you're delivering me a moment of a triumph in my writing life right now. So, you know, this as a debut author, I think this might be the biggest room I've had as an audience. So, thanks.
Yay! I think we need to all know a little bit more about what is in that headline, and most importantly, why you chose the Moscow Circus School.
Okay, so so that article is actually telling the story of how I rejected the idea of being a writer again and again and again in favour of doing things that were probably quite the opposite of a writing career, including being an aerialist, being a clown doctor, working for street theatre. But so yes, one of the first. So I suppose I had always wanted to write. You know, lots. I mean, I think is it Stephanie. You know, probably shares some of those kind of earnest childhood writerly traits. But at the age of, let's say, 19, having not yet been discovered for my, I would say, unexpressed talents, just latent talents that I thought somebody would magnetically somehow understand. Hadn't actually done anything about them, really. But I had a lot of faith that they should be recognised in the way that youth provides arrogance. So at some point I decided that, you know, obviously success had not come early enough, and I flipped the table for the first time, and that is when I decided to run away with the circus. So I had, at that time, I'd been working as an editor. I still do, more or less, work as an editor. I think I'd attempted novel number 1, which I'm happy to say doesn't even exist in a bottom drawer anymore. It was that bad. Novel number 2 we'll come to in a minute. That does exist in a bottom drawer. but yeah, so going to I was editing, I was attempting to write, desperately thinking I should be recognised for whatever, and fell in with the Carnies, which was great fun. So
it's also part of the story too of what we're going to discuss shortly.
Well, yes. So you might notice that there's some clues in the cover here around circus and performance.
Yes.
But yeah. So I did. If there were prizes for misspent youth, I would throw my hat in that ring.
Would you like to give us an example of something that you
are
incredibly ashamed about?
No, I wouldn't. No, I mean, I did just, several times I managed to throw my life off track. But going to the Moscow Circus School was probably one of my better choices.
And was that at Moscow?
It was actually Moscow. So you get up every morning. I was there from the end of summer into October. And around the time where they start papering up the windows. So that
cold,
terrible things like if a dog dies in the street, they don't discover the body until the thaw, right? That sort of thing. So you get up in the morning, I'd go there, I'd switch the lights on, and it was a training environment that replicated the circus arena. So very old-fashioned. And I still have some posters, actually, from that time, because they were tearing down the posters from the wall, and these were vintage circus posters. So
wow.
I still have one of those on my wall. So, yeah, that was one of my first attempts to not be a writer.
And clearly some of that experience is also in the book, so we will talk some more about that.
You can tell from the cover that it's a deeply serious interrogation.
So after all the fun and madness, you wrote your book, Violet Kelly and the Jade Owl, which I have to say is a fabulous page-turner. It's wonderfully set in a brothel. It has a cast of thousands. It is entertaining. It's a little bit sinister, which makes you kind of go, ooh. It does make you laugh out loud, and it's great fun. And we will talk more about some of the characters in that. But I want to also read you something else you wrote. It is 2023 and my debut novel has come out. Is it a piercing interrogation of the human psyche? It is not. It's a bedazzled romp through 1930s Sydney, knicker-draw via a mystery twisted enough to make Agatha Christie blush. Will it make you laugh? Dang, I hope so. Will you tell us about the fabulous Violet Kelly and the Jaded Owl?
Who doesn't like a ruffle through the knicker drawer? I mean, so the book is set in 1930. It's set in a house of pleasure called La Maison de Fleurs. The Maison is an invention for those who love to cleave to historical fact in their fiction. I can almost certainly tell you that such a thing would never have existed in Paddington at that time. So this was a kind of confection of the imagination. Imagine if there was a high-class brothel, sort of on the Parisian model, So, the gentlemen would be admitted sort of like a clubhouse, and they would be served cocktails and the girls would entertain. But, of course, it's a brothel as well. So... the main character, Violet. Shall I tell a little bit about characters and so on?
Let's first of all talk about how you got to write this book. Because after being a clown and after being a circus act and after not being as famous as you would have liked, you returned to Sydney and you start writing a little bit more seriously, and you started doing poetry and you started writing your PhD and you ended up at Verona. And for those of you who don't know, Verona is a...
Verona, the writer's house. Yeah, so that bit of the story. So, like Stephanie, my PhD writing friend, who's getting another name check, so I fast forward to, I guess, the early 2000s, before this had started, right? So I decided I would have a crack at the great Aussie novel first, because why wouldn't you? So I went and did a PhD program, and I gave it a red hot go, and wrote something very deeply earnest, and had to write the theoretical piece as well, right? So you have to submit your thesis, and
And what was it on? What was this very worthy tome?
Landscape and transformation in Australian fiction. Yes.
Something light and breezy.
So we're getting to the point where this book comes into it. So I'm staying on track, don't worry. So there I am. I'm at the end of the PhD writing process. My brain is, I would say, in a state of kind of jelly, actually. I couldn't really read anything apart from the most appalling trash. Couldn't read for enjoyment at all, actually, really. And so, and squeezing out these last few words of the PhD. Do you know Varuna, the Writer's House? Oh, it's this fantastic building in Katoomba. It was donated by the Eleanor Dark Foundation. She was a great supporter of writers, but she was an environmentalist. So it's this wonderfully sort of rarefied, hushed environment where people creep around in their socks because they don't want to, disturb the writerly business that's going on. So that's the world I was in, and I was like, and I'm not going to swear, I was like, I just have to do something I just have to entertain myself somehow. And Violet Kelly, the character, just came out. So that is what happened.
Just like that?
When you're trying to do something and something else happens. It's exactly what happened. So Violet Kelly arrived fully formed, the character. She arrived with her nemesis, as I was saying before, her sister Bernadette. And I knew right from the start that that Violet Kelly was going to be a character who had chosen brothel life because it was the best choice for her to demonstrate her agency, to obtain better social status and wealth. So, yeah,
she had
that's what happens.
Spent a considerable amount of time in an orphanage where Sister Bernadette was a very, very nasty woman. And we'll talk more about that sort of character.
That's right. But so, PhD, great Aussie novel, landscape and transformation, suddenly writing about a 1930s prostitute. That's how this book was born.
Yay! And thank God you did. Did you ever finish the PhD?
Oh, yeah, I did. I'm a doctor.
Oh, well, there
but,
you go.
Dr. Fiona. I think for all of our sakes that you should never go and look it up because I think those things do go down on the public record, but I would hate for any of you to read it, so please don't.
We might invite her back next year and after we've all read it, have a beer. So then you finished your manuscript. And what did you do? Because I think, we have quite a few budding authors in here, but I think some of us also like to know about the publishing process because it really is an unusual progression into becoming famous, or not. Okay,
so my experience of trying to get published is pretty typical. It involves lots of disappointment and self-recriminations and some unexpected wins. So I think if anyone here is aspiring to take that road, everybody must take heart because we all know that it does involve lots of twists and turns. But so of course I tried to shop the great Aussie novel around before I actually finished this one and nobody wanted it. I think that's fair, if I'm honest.
I think you were saved.
So fast forward, and I'd written probably only a few thousand words of this book. And then I think this almost brings us up to lockdown. So quite recently, I'd maybe written somewhere under 10,000 words, or around the 10,000 words mark, and a particular New Year's Eve with friends, where alcohol was involved. We made a commitment to each other that year we would achieve our creative ambitions. So each of us set a goal, and my goal was to try and get that 10,000 words seen by somebody, just for the hell of it, right? And it turns out that the Faber Academy was running publisher sessions. Meet the Agent sessions. So I thought, well, there you go, I'll do that. And so I took, sent the 10,000 words in, and the agent. So it was, I think, was the last person she saw in the day. So she was sitting across the table from me, and she went like this. She's got the paper, and she goes, "Oh, that bit's funny. Oh yeah, I like that bit." And then just put this one on for a few minutes, and I'm like, she gokind of gets the papers back together, and she goes like this. She goes, "So how much more have you got?" And I said, "Absolutely nothing." She goes, "Oh, okay." well, she said, you should probably finish that because somebody might buy it. So, and I think if all of you who are aspiring will know that just a comment like that can keep you going for about 3 years, right?
I have talent.
Somebody thinks somebody's going to buy something.
Yeah.
I might even get paid for this hobby that seems to cost me a lot of money. So, yeah. So,
because by this stage your hourly rate is about 2 cents.
I think I'm in the red, Benny. But we get into the public. You want to hear how it actually got picked up for publication? Yeah. So I did. I went and finished it, and then I went back to the same agent and said, "Here it is. Do you want it?" And she was like, "Actually, my books are full." So that was another one of those moments where I probably decided to not be a writer ever again. Although the circus was really out for me at that stage, given my advanced age. But I did chuck it into a competition with Allen and Unwin, and that is how it got picked up.
Yay, good on them.
So Allen and Unwin, so Sam, do I have more? Still out the back there. So they run a crime competition, or maybe they'll never run it again, I don't know. Maybe it was just a one-off, but there was a crime fiction competition. And so some point during lockdown, I got an email from Jane Palfman saying, the bad news is you haven't won, but the good news is we'd like to publish it anyway.
Yay, good for you.
Hooray for second prizes.
Some achievement. That's a big achievement.
Yeah, so that seems like a very long way to tell you the story of publication, but, it's a colourful story.
Well, and speaking of colourful stories, I think that the book is, because it's set in a brothel, and it is a very colourful brothel, there are quite a few colourful characters at La Maison de Fleurs.
There are.
And there are some amazing women and also some interesting men that visit the brothel. Would you please be kind and read a little from your book about our fabulous Dutch sea captain? And this will also sort of tell you a little bit about Violet as well.
You might also learn a little bit about what kind of book it is.
Yeah.
Okay. I've got my IKEA dockets for bookmarks because I'm that classy. Yeah. Violet Kelly frowned and shifted her position under the Dutch gentleman's stout torso. As luck would have it, her customer had arrived as the parlour clock struck the hour at the very same time she'd hoped to meet Albert. Now she would have to wait until evening to hear the news her old friend was so desperate to impart. What's more, the sea captain seemed to be losing momentum. Heck, had she lost her touch just as quickly as she'd acquired it? It was time to move things along or risk a lecture from Madame on technique, and that spectacle, with its mangled French and eye-watering mime, was to be avoided at all costs. Accordingly, she clasped the Dutchman tighter and emitted a hearty moan, one from her catalogue, right in his pink ear. Honestly, the perfect gasp could really put the lead in a chap's pencil. Sure enough, the sweaty captain found his rhythm. After several minutes of this, Violet found herself being reminded of Madame's Delft clock. The Dutch captain was positively metronomic. Violet stifled a yawn and smiled at the ornate ceiling. Before the frustrations of the last half hour, she'd been feeling a particularly sweet sense of satisfaction at her achievements. Here she was, at 18, a rich and sought-after professional nearing the zenith of her abilities, installed in the finest room of the house, surrounded by the most beautiful things. If one can learn the knack of enjoying life, she had thought, then I am a humble but committed student. Is that okay?
That's wonderful, and it is very funny. And it's set in the 1930s, and it's a wonderful look at Sydney in that time. So can you tell us why you chose the 1930s as an era of your wonderful brothel setting?
Well, 1930s Sydney, I think it probably lives rent-free in all of our imaginations because of the Razor Gang stuff, the repeated sort of fictionalizations and dramatizations of that era. So it's a very written about time, and for me, so rich in terms of social pressures, difficulties, violence. Yeah, I mean,
we're just coming out of the Depression too. So
actually, right in the Depression. So the book is set in 1930, and I think I was fascinated about what it might be to imagine a bubble of luxury and wealth in that time. Would you like to know about what I looked at in terms of references?
Yes, I think that's
so.
important.
So you might be familiar with Peter Doyle's fantastic photo book, which is what's it called? The crime photography. All of the stuff that's in the Police and Justice Museum from that same collection. There's a really fantastic book called The Great Depression in Australia or something, called by Jean Beaumont, which is a really interesting look at the social history. Because when you sit down to write something like this, you realise, I wonder how much a loaf of bread was, or what would you give to a kid to run an errand for you, or things like that. So, really interesting. You have to have a little bit of that sort of rich social history as well to understand.
And that comes out actually in the book. You've got some great research in there that gives the characters a lot of depth, and also the sense of place, which we'll talk about some more.
I was terrified of getting the historical detail wrong, and I'm sure I have in some parts, because it is a work of fiction, but the veracity that you get from those details. What did they eat? What did they wear?
And struggling to get food and stealing, and then of course we all know, and we'll talk more about people like Tilly Devine and Kate Leigh.
That's
those razor gangs that were around in those days too. So then you've got this kind of little mecca of wealth where the rich come to visit the girls, and there's some great characters in that. But there's also this very sinister underground, that permeates through the book, and the main bad guy is really mean and nasty and awful. But it's also really important to know that the girls in the brothel are having fun until they don't. And that is when you sort of the twist happens in the book. Now, some of these girls have got really strong characters. So tell us why you've got such great female role models in this, especially Madame, who is brilliant and all-knowing, but hiding her own secrets. And then Violet, she's the protector of the girls at a young age of 18, but she's pretty fiery. And then you've got these criminals like Tilly and Kate, but you've got these beautiful girls and the girls in the circus. So tell us a little bit about why you've chosen such a location to put these women in.
So, I think there's a few ways to answer that question. So, there were some pretty strong boss ladies in that time. We have the Tilly Devines, we have the Kate Leighs. So it's not inconceivable that you would have a very distinguished brothel owner, even if she does have a fake French accent, and she's actually from the bogs of Ireland. But it's not inconceivable that you would have women running a brothel, and in the course of the story, it becomes very clear that Violet is the protege. She's sort of the person you perceive as the favourite, and because she has that kind of status, she also rallies around the other girls, and they embark on a mission to save another girl from being trafficked, actually. So that's not giving away too much plot detail, I don't think. But so of course, for me, this is a very much story about how women are taking control and of their own destinies, and acting with agency to save one another and support one another. So it's very much a women's world. There are men in it, but it's a women's world.
It's a women's world.
Yeah.
But the men are interesting too. So you've got some like Doc Flanagan and
that's right.
Albert.
Yeah.
And I can't remember his name, the Chinese guy who is
Charlie Han.
Yes. Han, yep. And they're nice men. And they're good men, and they're funny men, and they look after the girl.
Oh, and that's not a story about all men being bad.
Yeah, but the bad is really bad.
Oh, but there are baddies, yeah.
Yeah.
In your classic old villain sort of way. Yeah.
Yes. And were you inspired by anyone in particular for your Doc Flanagan, for instance, who I thought was one of the great characters in the book?
I'm not sure I was. So Doc Flanagan he's an old army doctor and an old mate of the brothel owner, Madame's, and he comes. He's the brothel doctor. So you know, he's got a dubious list of tasks to carry out, but you know, he's a very stout-hearted, reliable, trustworthy, if a little bit hypertensive character.
But
so
he's non-judgmental.
That's right.
Yes.
That's
and actually,
right.
that's a thing I did like about the men in your book, is that they worked all as a team.
Well, I mean, I think that's the sort of stories of friendship and teaming in the story are actually, I mean, you know, that's kind of an idyllic kind of life for me. I mean, you know, well, I know it is. I love.
Sorry, I thought you meant like idyllic life in working in a brothel, but you meant friendship.
So my sister, who is very critical of me. Bless her, she's not here because she lives in Perth. But so she said, she read an early draft of this and she goes, "Oh, Fiona, you've just written a Mary Sue in Violet Kelly. Do you know what that means?"
No.
Like an idealised version of yourself. I was like, so, you know, but Violet is smart. She's got really long legs. She's really good looking.
Yeah. She's going to write a famous novel.
Well, she does sort of save the world, the novel.
That's right.
I mean, so, yeah, sorry, that went a bit off track. What was the question?
I think we've covered Doc Flanagan and the boy.
Doc Flanagan, yeah.
We're always in danger of running off track. But you know, the other thing I really loved about the book is Sydney and old Sydney and these really interesting places that we've read about. But there's lots of references to places like La Perouse, where there are shanty towns, which I didn't know a lot about. So it was really interesting to read about that. Some of the areas are fictional, but tell us about, you know, even Centennial Park, where you know, there were homeless people, and of course there were lots of people looking for work. Tell us about your research about, is it Happy Valley?
Oh, this is so juicy. So has anybody been to the La Perouse museum that sits in the middle of that sort of green space where the trams used to go around? Yeah. So, you know, that might have been what kicked off this idea for me. But there's great photographic references in there about the shanty towns that grew up in those sand dunes during the Great Depression. So these are people who couldn't even afford to live in the slums because they were getting kicked out of their lodgings. And, you know, in some cases they're walking all the way from the city, or they're putting their whole families on a tram. And they're setting up these little dwellings that are made out of, like, I don't know, wooden pallets or sackcloth. The kids are getting dressed in sackcloth. You probably know that famous story of they did it in the States and they did it here, where the flour manufacturers started printing the flour sacks so that they could be made into clothes. Yeah, so you know, there's a whole sort of world of Depression era furniture, which is made out of like kerosene tins and barrels and things like that. So this is all happening in La Perouse, in a place called Happy Valley. It was happening in Sydney, in Darlinghurst, and there was a famous place called Frog Hollow, I think, in Darlinghurst.
In Surrey Hills.
In Surrey Hills, Frog Hollow,
Hills.
yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I went looking for information on this. There is some in that Peter Doyle book. There is some in the La Perouse Museum. There is also an incredible set of audio interviews of mostly women, actually, who grew up in Happy Valley. I think it's from the National Sound and Film Archives, of people saying, you know, those were the best years of our lives. We had nothing, but there was a very kind of intentional nature of that community. So they were growing food.
And they were going to school too. Was that something I read, that they had to go to a local school, but they started...
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure.
But it was a community, a big community. And there was also a very large Chinese population, which also featured heavily in your book. Tell us about the Chinese in Sydney in those days.
Well, so look, I'm not certain I've extensively researched this, but this was, so the market gardening communities were some of the oldest Chinese communities in Sydney, as far as I understand. And so I've sort of made them adjacent, the market gardening communities and the slum dwelling or shanty dwelling communities of La Perouse, which is not entirely untrue. So, yeah.
Yeah. And, I love reading things that, you took the tram down to La Perouse and those things just don't exist anymore. So, but then
bring back the trams.
Yes, bring back
the trams.
Yes, absolutely. So I mentioned earlier in the that we have a lot of light and dark in the characters, but there's also a lot of things like superstition and sinister twists and homeless kids, and then there's also about Aboriginal communities that also are part of your novel, especially the circus troupes and the boxing troupes, and they earned a very good living doing those sorts of things.
So yeah, I mean, I think there were circuses and troupes that were touring at that time, and of course, I have a great love of the touring performer life. So there are these are small references in the book, but they are truthful. So the Brophies, the Aboriginal boxing troupe, they would take kids around up and down the coast. I think Silver's Circus, maybe Ashton's. I've forgotten the names now, just when I need them. But there were big family circuses that were operating around that time.
And you do write that very nicely about the circus acts, because clearly you've had some. But there's also a lot of references to tinsel and cabaret and girls doing a lot of performance.
I'm not going to lie, there are some gratuitous scenes of performance in this book. That probably don't move the plot forward. But
they're entertaining, I can tell you.
And I can tell you now, they were just there for me, really. Yeah. So, I mean, I hope you get some enjoyment out of them.
Well, they're really very colourful, and there's wonderful scenes where the girls are actually putting on performance for their male clients, and some of it is really quite fabulous.
Yeah, but it's very tongue-in-cheek.
It is.
So just, it's... it's intentionally very silly. So,
but underlying this, though, is a very sinister plot, and without giving too much away too, I think it's really important to talk a little about developing a plot like this. Would you like to kind of expand? Because you've also got so much humour in there, and then suddenly, bang, it slaps you in the face that this is a really nasty baddie.
So, I mean, so I think one of the sort of precepts of the book is that everybody carries a secret, right? Everybody's carrying a secret, and sometimes it's those secrets that lead us into difficulty. And in this case, it's one of Madame's secrets that puts La Maison de Fleur in peril. But it is Violet who comes up with a solution to save the girl who's being threatened with being trafficked. But then, of course, it turns out that Violet has secrets of her own as well, which put obstacles in their path. So you first encounter a villain who is... he's a gangster, a Chinese gangster, but he's only the front villain. So I actually always wanted there to be a much more sinister and shadowy, sort of all-seeing, all-knowing villain who I won't tell you much more about. But I think I remember hearing a quote once, and I think it might have been Robin Nevin or someone. It was to do with writing theatre, and the quote said, if you want to write darkness, if you want to write evil, think of the worst thing that you can think of, and then double it. So if you think about drama, if you think about what bad looks like, especially in a novel like this, where it's got sort of high volume, it's got a lot of highs and a lot of lows. So think of the worst thing you could think of, and then double it. So that's our villain, and he has some very sinister intentions for the girl that is being trafficked and simply must be rescued.
And they try in a wonderful way to rescue her, which is fantastic.
So it's a rescue story so much. I mean, the crime has not yet been committed. There were crimes were committed in the past that are being atoned for.
And they're the secrets.
So, yeah.
Yes, and there's lots of those. So there's many twists and turns. But then on that, though, you still kind of always have this fun up until a point where the girls are still enjoying life, and there's also some really great characters. Would you like to read us a little bit about, is it Philip, I think? Philip and Violet.
Okay, so I did toss up whether to read you a performance scene, But I decided I wanted to read you an interaction between Violet and another client because I just think it's funny. And also, she falls in love with this man. So this is a
very kind of like, in Pretty Woman, where you're not meant to kiss on the lips. There's a little bit of, you can't fall in love with the guy.
So this is a slightly longer piece, but I'll try and keep it, entertaining for you. His hands were square and expressive, the fingers long. A wedding band, she noted. Well, that was to be expected. She reached for a small gold ring with a carved inset of onyx, which adorned his little finger. She twisted it between her fingers. What's this one? He placed a champagne glass on the bedside table, then slipped off the ring and placed it in her palm. See the engraving? That's our family seal. A seal? Settle down, Rockefeller. Oh, let me tell you the story. My great-grandfather, Silas, made a packet selling pig iron to the British Railways. Bought land and a title off some mad syphilitic earl. You can do that, she broke in. Buy titles? He shrugged. As we both know, just because you're not allowed to do something doesn't mean it never happens. Quite right. She sank a fraction lower, allowing a little more of her body weight to rest on his fine, long torso. It was lovely to listen to the rumble of his voice inside the cage of his ribs. He continued. I think the Earl had to adopt my grandfather or something. Anyway, Silas wanted all the things a noble gent should have, so he commissioned this. She studied the engraving on the flat onyx disc, frowning. It's a sword and shield. He shrugged. See, pig iron maker. Not an ounce of imagination. She handed him the ring, then twisted to face him, her cheek against the fine hair of his chest. So let me guess, you grew up in a castle and everybody had to call you sir. They made you wear dresses until you were 5. You cried when they sent you off to boarding school because they wouldn't let you take your favourite polo pony. Oh, so close. My grandfather left an absolute fortune. I knew it, she thumped his chest. Ah, but wait. The family fortunes were fine until they landed in the hands of my mother and father. She lost all the cash by gambling with the true aristocracy. That lot have had generations to perfect their cheating. He drowned in the bath after a bottle of navy rum and a vigorous caning from his mistress. No, all true. Mamma was carted off after she threw herself out the drawing room window and only succeeded in breaking her ankles. After she died, I was brought up by aunts, school paid for by the church, spat on by the real posh boys, despised by anyone who was actually born to rule. See, said Violet, I read you like a book. Your powers are uncanny. Actually, it's a terrible story, I'm sorry. She gave him a squeeze. He wrapped his arms around her, resting his chin on the top of her head. Don't you want to know how the story ends, though? Let me guess. Depraved diplomat dies from heart attack in boudoir of sought-after fille de joie. I don't even know how to pronounce that. Joie. Joie. Sought-after fille de joie. Fille de joie, now you're just showing off. It's how I pays the bills. Also, I'm not dead yet. You're good, but not that good. How dare you? All right, tell me the rest of the story. He kissed the top of her head. It turns out the miserly aunts had invested in a little venture called the East India Company. After they died, I inherited everything. So if there's a moral, it's that you just never bloody know when fortune's going to favour you. Says the stinking rich man. But true nevertheless, my flower. She traced a finger along his collarbone. So you've travelled the world? Some of it, yes. And you've been to the Orient? Well, yes, I've travelled the subcontinent and China. I expect you've seen certain texts then, certain sacred illustrated texts, shall we say. Oh, you mean those kind of texts? Exactly. She unwrapped herself from his embrace and settled her head on the silk pillowcase, stretching luxuriously. So why don't you impress me with your knowledge of foreign parts? I'm blushing. You're blushing.
Well, I kind of found you were quite restrained in your sexual expression, let's say. Is that kind of your British background, or was that kind of a little...
So, well, we discussed this. I'm way too British to write actual sex. I can only write innuendo and Benny Hill jokes, pretty much. I mean, it's how I was raised.
Well, actually, I read, because I went reading this. I wasn't sure whether it's real, crime, but I think it's more historical crime. And I kind of think, is there such a thing as historical crime? Do we put it all in that one crime genre? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's crime adjacent. So when I appeared at the Bad Crime Festival, and I was on a panel which was Crime with a Smile. So, there are other people doing the same sort of thing, which is crime but make it funny, as TikTok would say.
Well, you've succeeded, I think.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Great. I read this interesting quote the other day by John Banville, and it said, "Most crime fiction, no matter how hard-boiled or bloodily forensic, is essentially sentimental. For most crime writers are disappointed romantics." Thoughts?
Thoughts. Well, it just makes me think about that comment that my sister said about having written an idealised version of myself. So, am I romantically imagining a life where I'm the heroine and I don't know. So Violet, I think, really is a bit of an idealised kind of character, right? So she is, she's full of all of that sort of romantic lead sort of pluck and candour and
bravado
and stout-heartedness, things that you want in a kind of romantic lead. So so there's that, and and she does. Am I allowed to sort of say ish how it ends? I'm just going to tell you no, okay. Well, so
they won't buy your book if you tell them.
I have some intentions around. I think that my bio on Instagram says, I think, well, maybe somewhere it says, I like to write stories where the girls come out on top. No spoilers, but I don't want any more Thelma and Louise stories where the girls have to drive their cars off a cliff. I want stories where they get to go from strength to strength. So that is romantic, and it is sentimental, and it is a value-driven premise. I agree. So is my take on crime romantic? Perhaps it is.
Yeah.
There's romance to a story where the baddies get what they deserve as well, right?
Oh, absolutely, and that's the great, and they get, but it's also, there's a very, a slim door where there's also the possibility of a sequel too, because they don't totally get away with it.
No, that's true. Just going back to the romance, sorry, I'm still working on that in my mind. I was also very clear that the driving narrative of this story would not be romance. So this is not a story about people falling in love, because also that's not the story I wanted to write in terms of girls ending, coming out
on top,
winning. Yeah,
and it's not a romance per se.
Romance does happen, but the kind of romance that you've already been treated to.
Yeah, and paid for. Yes, paid for, but I think
who hasn't been in situations where it should have been paid for.
Maybe that's a session for next year. We can take a vote on that about whether we have a session on girls on top. But I think the great thing about your book, which I really loved, is it is a page turner and it's a lot of fun, but it also does ask the question about power, and and even the trafficking that went on in the 1930s is still going on now, and it's young women. And you hear, you read the paper and you get this story about, girls being found in a cupboard in someone's house. This is, these bits of history continue on and on and on, and it's crime, and it's real crime. But I'm looking forward to certainly the next reincarnation of Violet. Do you have a plan for Violet, or what do you want to do with Violet?
Yes, I do. There may or may not be a book 2 already mostly written. Huzzah! It's kind of a continuation of this one, because
there's a lot
certain
unsaid.
Enemies don't get vanquished adequately, let's just say. So there's some scope for more vanquishing, and along the way, perhaps a few more silly shows They do have some good parties in the second book too. Again, for my entertainment mainly. They visit the Blue Mountains. They spend a lot of time in the Blue Mountains. And I actually have spent a lot of time in Katoomba and Leura. And has anybody here visited, what's the name of that 1930s house with the gardens? Everglades?
Oh, yes, it's a fantastic.
Well, so there's a whole Everglades cult, spiritualist cult thing going on.
Oh.
Because why not? And there's still crime, don't worry.
Yes, well,
Are we winding up? No, is that
we're getting yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I believe we can have some questions, but ask her anything really. It doesn't have to be.
Turns out.
Yeah.
So that's amazing. Who would like to ask the first question? And
Don't be shy.
have the microphone. Someone hold the microphone.
You've mostly answered my question, so it's more of a fangirl thing.
Stop.
And I wanted to fangirl the organisers that we've got a first-time author in amongst authors that
Thank you very much. Actually means a lot.
yeah, and like an awesome replacement speaker that should have had a spot in their own right.
Thanks.
And I've been saying to people that I see you and Violet as the worthy successors of Kerry Greenwood and Phryne Fisher.
Yeah.
So there's a strong. I think they would be friends. I think
I
Violet
think
Kelly
she's
and
her niece from another mother or something.
yeah.
Yeah.
Although Violet's been dragged through the gutter.
So was Phryne in her youth.
That's true.
Yes.
She had a difficult start in life.
She did.
I mean, look, I'm a Kerry Greenwood fan. I read loads and loads of Phryne Fisher. So there's definitely a strong influence there. I think I just wanted I think my sensibilities are a bit dirtier, probably.
So stoked that there's another one coming. So I hope
Thanks.
the publishers have given you at least a 5-book deal.
Anyone from Allen and Unwin here?
No, but we can pass it on.
Thanks.
So the audience went crazy.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm really looking forward to reading the book. It sounds wonderful. And you said that basically that character came fully formed to you, which must have been a wonderful thing. When you decided to put her into, tell her story, I'm just curious about how plotting. Did you go, right, here's this character. How did you go about plotting the novel? Are you somebody who writes a story a line that goes, this happens, and then you join the dots, or did you just fly by the seat of your pants?
So, look, there's a few things there. So I think because Violet was so clear in my head, it was quite easy to build the world around her. As for the plot, I am quite a structural plotter, but then I will freeform, but I'll have really clear milestones. And sometimes those milestones are only a chapter apart. So I need to know where it has to end. The thing about this book is I had the ending in my head right from the start. So all of the things that happen were always going to end where they end. And for anyone who's read the book, they will know what that means. I think you start by putting one foot in front of the other, and then the sort of complexities of the plot start to develop by themselves. The idea of having a trafficked girl, actually, I think I realised that this came from, why didn't they ask Evans? I didn't realise that until I put the book out, probably. But anyone who's an Agatha Christie fan will know that the trafficked girl's sort of, although set in Sydney in 1930s, but I think that actually has that genesis. But yeah, what you find during the editing process as well is that everything sort of starts to contract as well, right? So the tightening and the tightening and the tightening gives you this real kind of new appreciation of that structure, and the gaps between everything just go like this. So yeah, so you start with something, but it's the editors who finish it for you, really.
It's a fantastic cover on the book.
Yes.
How do you come to the decision of what to have? Who influences it? How much say do you have, or the publisher have, in the design of the cover?
That's a very good question, because this cover is actually illustrated by the person who illustrates Kerry Greenwood's Phryne Fisher series. So that was a very deliberate decision by the publishers, I think, to align it with, and to signal to readers that this is within the same genre. Funnily enough, so what happened with this cover is that they sort of get a graphic designer involved first to do a sort of structural picture, and then they get the illustrator involved, and the illustrator is Beth. What's her name? This is where I don't have my glasses.
It'll be on the inside cover.
Yes.
Look, just from a publishing point of view too, covers are the things that people fall out over 99% of the time. It is hilarious that three grown-up human beings can sit there crying over the font of a book because all three of you want something different. This is a really terrific cover because it basically says everything to you. And actually our previous author, Dan, was talking about how much he liked his jacket. Authors don't always have a say. Publishers feel very strongly about who they want to attract in the market, who they're trying to compare to. You'll see a lot of those crime fiction of Connolly and Grisham will all have a similarness.
I call them the black and red ones.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, and romance fiction, you would have seen a lot of the rural romance. Girl in a hat, man in a horse down the road. That
The Richard Osman looky-likeys.
Exactly,
yeah.
So, and it is one of those areas that does cause a great deal of discussion. And to also say that this jacket will look like this in Australia, but in England it will look completely different, and the US will look completely different as well, which is very interesting.
I was just going to say, though, in my head, the cover always looked a bit like this. So when we never cried over it.
You didn't cry
because we just
That's
didn't
good.
disagree. But they said, well, what do you think? And I was like, I think it should be the building. And they were like, we think it should be the building too. So that was a lovely confluence of artistic ideas.
Well, I think we're good. Thank you all so very much, and mostly thank you, Fiona. It is an amazing book.
Thank you.
A wonderful debut.